Welcome to the Laws of Business podcast. Here, we will share the skills you need to make your business a success. Learn about goal setting, productivity, time management, marketing, and much more. Hear inspiring stories with today's best business leaders and join a hub of thousands of passionate entrepreneurs across the world. And now, here's your host, Jamil Jama.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Law of Business podcast. I'm your host, Jamil Jama, and today we're going to be talking about avoiding branding nightmares, protecting your most valuable assets, avoiding social media mishaps, building an intellectual property. I'm going to be interviewing Robert Klinck, also known as Bobby Klinck. Robert Klinck is a best-selling author and intellectual property attorney. He helps entrepreneurs, startups, and innovators harness the power of their intellectual property rights and reduce exposure to lawsuits or brand challenges in the marketplace. His book, The Entrepreneur's IP Planning Playbook, provides a short, understandable roadmap for entrepreneurs, from solopreneurs to startup founders, to handle their intellectual capital. Too many entrepreneurs think of intellectual property as a legal issue when they should actually be thinking about it as part of their overall business strategy. An effective intellectual property strategy can give business a leg up on their competition, and Bobby is on a quest to help educate entrepreneurs about this topic. Bobby shares both his personal story and advice for other entrepreneurs about how they can use intellectual property to their advantage and why patents, copyrights, and trademarks don't need to be scary, complicated topics. Bobby's personal entrepreneurial quest hasn't always been easy. He started his one law firm out of necessity when his daughter was 2 months old. After initially struggling to find his path, he finally had a eureka moment when he found his why to help other entrepreneurs. Bobby loves to tell the story of how finding his purpose as a lawyer led to a more fulfilled life. Listeners can take lessons from Bobby's experience that apply to any field. Bobby also teaches the listeners about the importance of creating an intellectual property strategy by telling stories, including horror stories. He tells stories about the mistakes that too many entrepreneurs make that can lead to business and personal disaster. From areas that could sink a brand to social media mishaps, Bobby shares real-world stories to drive home the importance of putting an IP plan in place. Bobby's easygoing, plain-spoken style makes even the most complicated intellectual property issues easy to understand for non-lawyers. Listeners will walk away from the interview knowing what they need to do to protect their brands and to avoid the kinds of mistakes that can sink a business. It's a real pleasure to welcome Bobby Klinck. Bobby, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Jamil. It's a pleasure.
So, Bobby, you're originally from Texas, but you're currently staying in Washington, D.C., right?
That's right. Yeah, I was born and raised in a town called McAllen, which is about 5 miles from the Mexican border, about 50 miles from the coast. And now I'm about, probably about 1,500 to 2,000 miles away from there in Washington, D.C.
Did I also mention that you're author of 2 Amazon best-selling books?
I think you did mention them.
I did mention that you're a Harvard Law School graduate.
Yeah, that's right. That's where I started my career. I had the pleasure of attending Harvard, which was a wonderful experience, and it's kind of launched me. But strangely, in some ways, having that pedigree was one of the things that held me back early on from being an entrepreneur, because it gave me the chance and the opportunity to work at some very established firms where I had a safe, comfortable job, making a good living. And so it took a lot to get over and get past that safety to decide to go out on my own and really do what I wanted to do.
There's a quote: "Your brand name is only as good as your reputation." How can someone avoid branding nightmares?
Yeah, and one of the I'm glad that that's the first area you want to talk about, because branding and trademarks especially are the area where just about every entrepreneur is going to have to think about that issue. Some other areas of intellectual property, like patents, don't affect some entrepreneurs, but just about every entrepreneur needs to be thinking about their brand. And some people would say that the brand isn't about a trademark, a logo, a name, et cetera, and that's true. But your name is certainly a very important part of your overall identity as a business and as a company. And a lot of entrepreneurs will spend a considerable amount of time brainstorming, spitballing, thinking through, testing, and doing all of these other issues to try to come up with the perfect name for their business from a business perspective. And then they come up with something and they just love it and they get wedded to it, and they don't take a common sense step to make sure that they can actually use that name to make sure that someone else hasn't trademarked it. And Jamil, I know we've talked about, you previously had an issue come up where you decided to change the name of this podcast because you were concerned that Entrepreneur Magazine might assert its trademark for the word entrepreneur against you. And again, that's a good example, and it's an interesting example. I haven't dug into that particular issue to think through whether you probably could have you kept using the name Entrepreneur Stories. But what you learned is that, quite honestly, as a small business person, as a startup, you can't afford to have the fight. So you need to make sure that whatever name you choose isn't just a good name from a business perspective, but is a name that isn't going to run you into a legal dispute with an established company. And here in the United States, it's pretty easy to do that. You can go on to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office and do a search through their system to find out, trademarks that are registered with either your entire name or any portion of your name to get a sense of what's out there. And then, I also say, do some common sense, go onto Google and type the name and see what comes up. So that's the biggest issue. And the problem is if you're going to have a problem, you want it to be at the very beginning before you spent time, energy, and money establishing your brand. So that's why I suggest people do this as soon as they pick a name. Go out and make sure that it's a name you can actually use.
Definitely, Bob. And just to let the listeners know, the podcast used to be called Entrepreneur Stories, but because the business name Entrepreneur is trademarked by Entrepreneur Magazine, I had to change it to the Law of Business. So it's called the Law of Business now, which is a better name anyway, in my opinion.
Yeah, but Jamil, but I think this is the point. Why don't we talk about this briefly? I assume you would have rather changed the name before you would put out all of the podcasts you had put out previously under the name Entrepreneur Stories.
Definitely.
And so that's the point. Now you, in a sense, have, this podcast out there under two different names, and it's a small issue, but it's an issue that you would have rather avoided. And, something that I just want to get entrepreneurs thinking about trademark, just so it becomes something on their checklist that they go over. You can always go the second step of actually getting a trademark yourself, but that's in some sense an optional step. The most important thing is to make sure that someone else isn't already using the name.
Definitely. And how can someone protect their most valuable assets? How to make sure your employees? How does somebody make sure the employees don't walk out the door with your company secrets?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is that for most entrepreneurs who have employees, the most valuable assets they have are the know-how within the business. And it will often come in the form of know-how that's built up and some advantage. For example, your customer list, your CRM database, all of those things have immense value to you as a company. And so you need to have common sense steps and practices in place to make sure that your employees can't leave and take all of that information with them and start a competing business.
Like Facebook, right?
Well, that could be one thing, but it's a much more subtle thing. So again, if you're running, let's just use a simple example. Let's say that you're running a lawn business where you cut lawns for a living, and that's what you do, and you have a couple of employees, and you have 150 employees, and you're obviously not doing it yourself. You have other people cutting the grass, and they know how much you charge and all those things. Well, you need to have a policy and a written agreements in place so that when one of your employees can't leave with your list of 150 customers with all of their contact information and go and undercut your service by $20 per cut and say, hey, why don't you come and use me? And so this is an area that falls within what's called trade secret law. In the States, it's pretty easy to protect, and I suspect it's you'd have a similar thing under English law. But the concept is, if you have valuable information that's not generally known to the public, so long as you take reasonable steps to protect it, someone can't then use it even if they get it. So in this case, what you need is agreements with all your employees that they can't use the information they learn while working for you to compete with you or for any purpose other than to to make your business go forward.
Would that be a non-disclosure agreement? Sorry to cut you off there.
Yeah, it's something like that. So here in the States, a lot of people will try to put non-competes in place, and those are a separate issue. Some states here in the United States won't even enforce them no matter what. California, for example, you pretty much can't have a non-compete. And that's a clause that says, hey, you can't even compete with me for a certain period of time. But instead, it's just a confidentiality agreement. So you should have a written agreement with all your employees, even if you don't need it for employment purposes, that simply says all of the confidential information you learn during your employment with me, you will not use for any purpose other than my business. It's just that simple. If you have an agreement, again, you don't need to hire someone like me to write that clause. Just use, common sense language that says you can't use this information. And, you might want to go ahead and list it out and say, for example, customer lists and anything that you can think of that you have that's confidential, you should have, make sure that you have some common sense protections for.
And Bobby, I remember in 2002 when I visited my doctor, he was using a computer and he said to me, you better start learning how to use computers because soon everybody will be using computers. And now it's 2017 and people are saying companies better start using social media because soon all companies will need to have a social media account. So how can someone avoid social media mishaps? How to avoid developing policies to make sure you and your employees don't create legal liability on social media?
Yeah. So in social media, there's, again, the common sense policies that you need to have in place, which you probably don't need. Most entrepreneurs don't need me to tell you, but, you should have a written policy about kind of what's acceptable and not. For example, some brands will want to be edgy, others won't. And so that needs to be set out. But that's more of a business perspective than it is an IP perspective. From an IP or an intellectual property perspective, one of the things you need to be thinking about is issues like using images and make sure that the images, you have the proper licenses to use them and that it's not a copyrighted material that you can't be using. For the case of social media, one of the big things that's come up, and this is a very small part of intellectual property, but it is a part, is companies have started using or tried to use the images of famous people using their product without an actual endorsement deal. I'm trying to remember, one of the pharmacy chains had this issue come up recently. I think someone had snapped a picture of an actress walking out of one of their drugstores. I think it was in New York, but it doesn't really matter, somewhere. And the company then kind of retweeted it and was trying to use that in their marketing. Well, the problem is then you're using that person's likeness and they have likeness rights to promote your brand. So that's something you need to be careful about and be very, wary of doing that and using anyone else's celebrity if they haven't agreed to be an endorser. And if you're a small entrepreneur, you almost certainly haven't paid anyone for their rights. But the other things are avoiding using unlicensed images or other copyrighted material. That's what you have to be careful about primarily from a legal perspective.
Yes, and let's talk about building an intellectual property plan. How to build a strategy to maximize the value of your assets and minimize the risk of being sued. How can someone do that?
Well, the first thing they just need to be doing is thinking about it. So many entrepreneurs just don't think about intellectual property and they don't take the time to create a plan. And that's really a stunning fact, although I guess it's not. I have plans for various parts of my business, and I'm sure I don't have plans for other parts that I need. But having an intellectual property plan, and that just means coming up with a strategy for dealing with these issues, is a must for a business. By the estimates of valuation experts, for most companies, the value or the intellectual property and intangible assets of that company are somewhere between 40 and 95% of the value of a company, depending on what kind of company. A manufacturing company, it's going to be on the low end. Online entrepreneurs, it's going to be on the high end. Startups, it's going to be on the high end because most of your value at that point is in your idea, in your brand, in those types of issues. So the question I always ask people is, how can you afford to not have a strategy to deal with what is almost certainly your largest class of assets? The process of creating a plan, I lay it out in my book, The Entrepreneur's IP Planning Playbook. But really it's kind of a two-part process. First, you catalog all of your potential intellectual property that you have. So all your inventions or potential inventions you've come up with, your innovations, everything related to your brand. So again, your name, your slogan, your logo, product names, just anything you can think of. Then your potentially relevant copyrighted material, which is any kind of written work with any level of creativity, any musical work, any videos, all of that stuff listed. And then things like your trade secrets. So what I suggest that people do is list all of that, come up with a complete catalog of it, mark whether you've protected it or taken steps to protect it, figure out how important it is to your business. Again, is this something that's critical to your business, or is it kind of a little tangent that doesn't matter much? And from that process, you can kind of do something like a triage where you find what are the most important issues I need to be dealing with today, and what are the things I can let go of it. And the reason you do that is, unless you're Facebook, for example, you are going to have to make choices about protecting certain things and not protecting other things just from budgetary constraints. And so by doing this triage, you're able to really see everything all at once and come up with an overall strategy rather than just making individual ad hoc decisions that will almost certainly not be the best decisions for your business. You want to make sure that if you have $10,000, you're going to spend that $10,000 in the most effective way possible. The second part of the process is making sure you have policies and procedures in place to avoid stepping on other people's rights. So that's things like doing a trademark clearance, making sure that you have policies about getting the licenses for any copyrighted material you use, et cetera. And that is kind of a more routine process, but you just need to set up policies and procedures to make sure it gets done.
Yeah, and Bobby, can some of this information or all of this information be found in your book, The Entrepreneur's IP Planning Playbook?
Yeah, you can find pretty much that book is about 75 pages, and it walks you through the process of creating an IP plan and thinking about the issues you need to think about. And there's even some sections about if you're a company with more than one or two employees, you need to be thinking about putting together a team within your business who are tasked with this process, because you need to have a centralized group of people. But all of that is discussed in the book. And
you've represented clients in cases involving hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yes, I have.
That's awesome. So, Bobby, where can you be contacted, please?
Well, so people can find my website is the first place, and that's www.klinckllc.com. And Klinck is Klinck. So it's KLINCKLLC.com. And you'll find a lot of free information on there. My books I give away for free. I'm not trying to make a living selling books about intellectual property to business people. That would be a pretty tough way to make a living. I put it out there to try to educate people and make entrepreneurs as knowledgeable as possible. Also, I have a brief course that people can take. It's kind of a 4-day course that you'll get via email about putting together an IP plan. You'll get a free download copy of the book and some of the checklists that we use in the process. And that is at klinckllc.com/podcast. So you can get that information there. On social media, you can reach out to me. I'm most active on Twitter, and it's at Bobby Klinck, and that's BOBBY. KLINCK.
That's awesome, Bobby. Thank you so much. Bobby, I want to thank you so much for taking your time to come on the show.
Yeah, I thank you for having me.
And I want to thank all the listeners for tuning in. I'm sure you got much value from this interview. And I'm Jamil Jama. This is The Law of Business, and that was Bobby Klinck's story. Thank you all very much for listening.
Thanks for listening to the Laws of Business podcast. Find out more about us on thelawsofbusiness.com. Thank you for being a part of our journey.